Like a lot of Unreal Engine games, Silent Hill 2 stutters, and it stutters a lot. Why is it happening? How can it be fixed? I wanted to explore those questions for this video, but while making it, I stumbled upon something altogether unexpected that is perhaps even more troubling than any spike on a frame time graph. What do I mean by that? Well, grab a drink, pull up a seat as I examine Silent Hill 2 on PC.
Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by MSI's range of next-generation QD-OLED monitors, available in 32 and 27-inch 16:9 configurations, along with ultra-wide 32:9 49-inch and 21:9 34-inch models. These are some of the best monitors we've ever tested, with incredible motion clarity, HDR True Black 400 support, OLED burn-in protection, AI features and genuinely game-changing performance. Check the video description to learn more, and for UK viewers, a chance to win an MSI 27QRX QD-OLED, a Metaphor ReFantazio PC and Xbox game code, and exclusive tote bag.
Before I get into the stutter stuff, I want to talk about some other things, as the PC version of Silent Hill 2 does a couple nice things that I actually like. The graphical options are generally okay, and there are some positive surprises like dynamic resolution scaling, although it only unfortunately works with Unreal Engine's TSR. Still, the options have great visual scaling above and beyond the PS5 version, which is praiseworthy in this day and age. As we can see in the menu here, you have the ability to turn on ray tracing with a simple on and off toggle. The game always uses ray tracing actually, but this enables hardware-based ray tracing for lumen, diffuse GI, and reflections instead of software ray traced lumen. As you can see in this example, reflections, when compared across the settings, have a profound difference, with the quality of the ray traced reflections being much higher with this ray tracing setting on, as real geometry is used instead of blobby SDFs. Compared to the PS5 version, the difference is even more stark, as the PS5 version uses software lumen but with a resolution for the SDF tracing that is much lower internally than it is possible to be set on PC, which leads to a rather pixelated look. While hardware ray tracing looks comparatively pristine, this pristineness of the ray traced reflection extends to extremely small things, like grass on the ground, which is only managed via screen space reflections with software lumen like on PS5, which makes it flickery and unstable, while the hardware ray traced reflections look rather pristine in comparison. Reflections just look a lot better on PC with or without hardware lumen RT on in general due to the resolution differences of the tracing. With hardware RT, you also get reflections of animated skinned objects that you do not get on consoles. So if you look, you can even see James in mirror reflections that will not be there on PlayStation 5. The more accurate RT in general also means just less screen space errors, like here in the shot from a cinematic. Notice how James's foot on the left on the PS5 side looks like it's floating above the ground due to the disconnection in the reflections there caused by screen space artifacts. This is not the case with hardware lumen, and the reflection on the right looks just right. Hardware RT also enables more accurate diffuse indirect lighting, commonly known as global illumination, especially in indoor scenes, like near this windowsill where the directional light from the sky outside is much more intense with hardware lumen, and we can see how it is bouncing off the objects in the scene in a more accurate way, like on this back wall here, where software lumen on PS5 doesn't capture the bouncing of the light around the room as well. For other indoor scenes like in this bar, we can see more accurate lighting locality, where the table, for example, with hardware lumen, is no longer floating on the ground due to light being misaligned from the window's reflections behind it. So in general, the lighting lines up with the world geometry better. While testing GI on PC, I did notice a curiosity. With ray tracing off using software lumen, the PC version of global illumination is actually the same as the high scaling setting in UE5 that we find in the PS5's performance mode. This tends to use a lower quality SDF and turns off SSGI, so in this shot here that we're looking at, The software lumen on PC lacks the indirect shadowing on these plants here, just like PS5's performance mode. Although admittedly, I do think it looks kind of blobby and physically implausible on the higher, presumably epic quality setting that we see on PS5's quality mode. Basically, the PC version's software lumen is not as high quality technically as it could be. It doesn't appear to be using the epic setting which UE5 offers. And beyond that, I also found that it doesn't necessarily match the visual output that we see on PS5's performance mode 1-to-1. If you compare, they look kind of different, like we're seeing here. Also, in that bar that I showed off earlier, it is ultra dark and poorly lit in software lumen on the high setting and in the performance mode on PS5. But it's also easy to see in this scene that the lighting quality is slightly different on PC. The bar stool here can be more easily seen on PS5's performance mode while not on PC, so they're somehow different. Either way, the unique ray tracing only found on the PC version here adds a lot to the visuals, and in general, I think this game looks really great. Though I did notice a number of visual flaws that deserve to be pointed out, so they could be fixed in future patches. For example, nearly all cloth I saw moving in the game runs at 30 FPS no matter your frame rate target, so fluttering drapes and flags in the wind look pretty awkward and rather bad. Same with cutscenes. All cutscenes in the game lock to 30 FPS using UE5's frame rate capper. This is really bad form all around, as nothing should ever be force capped to 30 on PC. It's especially bad though for non-VRR monitor users, as UE5's frame rate capper is poor and it has improper frame pacing. This also affects the PS5 version in its performance mode as far as I can tell, so you'll get improper frame pacing in all the cutscenes in this game. Another issue I noticed is with hardware lumen. As I showed off earlier, it can look a lot better, but it also has a couple bugs in its visual presentation. For example, grass sometimes can be super flickery and poor looking, like we see here. Just a swimming mess of occlusion. It looks like really bad SSAO almost. I've also seen it where hardware lumen flickers on and off momentarily when crossing a point in the world, and if you sit at that point in the world, well then you can see it constantly flickering on and off. There are other image quality issues as well, like how lumen reflections in software or hardware mode look really grainy with the standard Unreal denoiser, looking like they're boiling on some of the more glossy surfaces in the game. Another issue is with the game's leaves. As they cross in front of reflections, the denoiser causes big trails behind them, and this happens with any upscaler you choose in the game. But I noticed with DLSS, it fares worst as the leaves can also have long streaks behind them even when not flush against reflective surfaces. There are a lot of other flaws, maybe too numerous to describe, but another thing I've noticed since Silent Hill 2 launched is how the community on PC, modders, are attempting to fix some of the visual shortcomings. For example, the denoiser I showed off earlier. People have modded in DLSS ray reconstruction, as I'm showing here, which greatly aids in the game's rendering of lumen reflections. It looks a lot better. Likewise, people have come up with guides to change DLSS's version and parameters to fix the leaves in the game so they don't have the big trails behind them. Even I got into the modding spirit while playing, and I added this variable to the system config to add ray trace transparency reflections instead of just SSR plus lumen probes like it uses per default. I think this greatly aids in the glass rendering. As always, PC modders are making the best of the situation here and trying to make this game better, and hopefully Bloober can take inspiration from that. But one thing modding in general should not be expected to fix is the game's stuttering, and this is where I'll come into it. Yes, there is stuttering all throughout the gameplay experience in Silent Hill 2. It's technically not the worst I've seen, but it's also pretty close to the worst I've seen. So where is it coming from? Based on my tests, it's not shader compilation stutter as commonly found in previous Unreal Engine games usually. As you start a new game for the first time, you can actually notice how there's an elongated moment when the game pauses and loads, and during this time, you can actually notice your CPU getting blasted. Shader compilation is occurring. It takes around 30 seconds on a 7800 X3D, and then doubly as long on something like a Ryzen 5 3600. If you run through the same area multiple times in a row, you will always see the same stutters occurring no matter how often you run by the area. Usually with a shader compilation issue, that would not be the case. They would lessen the second or third time you run through an area. So based upon my play of the game so far, I do not think shader compilation is the basis. Rather, I think it is done by some sort of loading and deloading or actualization of game objects while walking around the world, aka traversal stutter. Traversal stutter is something that nearly every single Unreal Engine game has, and this one has it as well. No system is immune to it. I get them on a Ryzen 7 7800X3D, which is arguably the best CPU out there at the moment for video gaming. When you unlock the frame rate on this CPU, I found them to be typically within the 16 to 25 millisecond range on that CPU. So yes, they technically would disrupt 60 FPS gameplay. I also noticed some of the hitches could be larger on the CPU, even though those were a bit rarer. Like in this alleyway, moving around there, I saw some hitches going above the 33 millisecond range. And there were some bigger ones actually. For example, when you go by this bar in the game, I noticed some 25 millisecond frame time spikes next to a larger 50 millisecond frame time spike on the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. Now these are spread all throughout the entire experience of play, and as far as I can tell, they happen more or less frequently depending upon the area you are in, with some areas being worse than others. For someone like me, this absolutely ruins the game's atmosphere. The hitches though are worse on slower CPUs. On a Ryzen 5 3600, I measured hitches being roughly 2 times the length usually. So if a hitch was around 16 milliseconds on the bigger CPU, it would be around 33 milliseconds on this slower one. That is typically the case, though there are some areas where the hitch size does not scale in such a linear way. Sometimes you'll see the Ryzen 5 3600 showing a longer period of frame time spikes not found on the bigger CPU. For example, that bar I showed off earlier, there the hitching was 75 milliseconds with 40 millisecond ones rounding it off. So a little different than the 7800X3D. But the general rule is the better your CPU is, the smaller these hitches will be, but they are still very noticeable, and they're very noticeable for a reason I will get to momentarily. Reading online though, I see a lot of misconceptions that the situation is much better on PS5, and unfortunately, I can say it is not. There, it is in general harder to measure the exact length of stutters occurring because VSync is on, and that gets in the way of actually measuring things. But it is plain as day to see while just walking around, and it is very obvious in the game's 30 FPS mode. To contrast with PC, let's show the intro of the game going down that hill again. On the Ryzen 5 3600, we see a lot of spikes there, with the frame times being between 30 and 60 milliseconds depending upon which spike you look at. These look really big on the frame time graph because we can unlock the frame rate there, so they stand out more from the base frame time. On PlayStation 5, going down that hill with VSync shows a similar story. It's just VSync is increasing the base frame time, and it limits our knowledge to the length of each hitch. What we see there are continuous VSync drops to 50 milliseconds and even a drop to 66 milliseconds. Basically, all the hitches I showed off on the Ryzen 5 3600 are happening on the PlayStation 5, but they manifest a little bit differently due to VSync. We can also see them sometimes manifesting with a different cadence. On PC, opening this fence door on the Ryzen 5 3600 shows a couple of spikes between 30 and 40 milliseconds, and then as James gets further down the road, there are 3 spikes of around 25 milliseconds again. On PS5, it looks a little different. As James goes through the door, there we see about 4 50 millisecond VSync dropped frames, and a bit further up the road, we see a similar story as to what we saw on PC, but once again, VSync is changing the base frame time here, so it looks slightly less spiky on the frame time graph. Another difference I noticed is that PS5 can spread out the hitches a little bit. For example, when I go to that pub on the Ryzen 5 3600, you can see those 2 hitches in the 75 to 90 millisecond range. On PS5, when I ran near the pub, I instead saw a full second filled with 9 50 millisecond VSync dropped frames. So the frame time drop can be a little bit more spread out over time on PS5 than it is on PC apparently. Either way, it doesn't look very smooth on that platform as well. Playing this game on console does not make it a lot more smooth, as traversal stutter always seems to affect console and PC. But that is not the only issue here in Silent Hill 2. Unfortunately, the game also suffers from animation smoothness issues pretty much exactly like I saw in Jedi Survivor, and this surprised me. And in my testing, I think this affects both console and PC, but I can only say with great certainty that something is really wrong on PC, and let me tell you about that. Now, to show you what I mean, let's look at the Ryzen 7 7800X3D's performance again. As I showed off earlier, going down that hill in the intro to the game shows frame time spikes on all machines, and on the 7800X3D, they are pretty short actually. When CPU limited, I measured them to being at the highest, a little bit below 25 milliseconds. Now usually if you saw frame time spikes up to something like 25 milliseconds, the logical assumption for a player would be, okay, let's cap the frame rate to 30 FPS to get a perfectly smooth experience, because none of the stutters, which are 25 milliseconds, would exceed the 33.3 milliseconds of the 30 FPS frame rate cap. The frame rate cap will essentially hide unevenness in frame times. Well, that is not what happens in this game. Check out this footage of the game running on the 7800X3D again, but capped at 30 FPS running down the hill. Take note how it doesn't look smooth at all. There are multiple moments where the animation jumps, rapidly accelerating, and it looks like some sort of frame time hitch has occurred. That should not be the case though. And in fact, looking at the frame rate and frame time reading, we can see that the game is a flawless 30 FPS where each frame is perfectly spaced with 33.3 milliseconds. The thing is, the animation of the frames is heavily flawed. And this is not the first time I've seen this in an Unreal Engine game, and this behavior perturbs me greatly as it goes against all of my knowledge about how animation in games should be handled. I had a hunch as to what the problem might be based upon a blog I recently read from Daniel Holden, who works at Epic in animation. Basically, the blog describes something about how delta time is flawed. You don't need to know too much about this, but delta time is essentially the way a game engine can slice up the time for rendering when the frame time is variable so that animations still smoothly animate. In this blog, Daniel points out that the way people and game developers have accounted for variable frame time for animation has been a poor fit in the past, and it has led perhaps to unnecessary animation stutter. The problem is what Daniel is talking about in his blog is actually in reference to frame times exceeding the cap set. In my example on the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, the frame times as measured when unlocked are not exceeding 33.3 milliseconds. They are not exceeding a 30 FPS cap, yet I'm still seeing the animations looking really poor with a 30 FPS cap. So something is especially wrong here, just like something is especially wrong in Jedi Survivor. So I decided to do another test, but this time making it so the game doesn't use delta time anymore. So the game does not expect variable frame rates. I set it to a fixed tick at 30 FPS using this launch parameter that I was made aware of by Tom Lumen and Peter Svetikov. This parameter makes it so that the game is always stepping its time by a 33.3 millisecond interval. The issue of using a fixed tick like this is that if the frame rate is above or below 30, well then the game speed changes, which can look hilarious of course, as we're seeing right here, running far above 30 FPS. To avoid that, I locked the game externally to 30 FPS, and the game speed is then normal again when I do that. And guess what? When I run down that hill in the intro of the game, there is zero animation weirdness, no animation stutters. It looks completely smooth. In a side-by-side, it is painfully obvious how bad the default game is. On the left, using delta time and a 30 FPS cap, the animations are just not smooth. On the right, with a fixed tick and a 30 FPS cap, the animation is smooth as butter, or at least as smooth as 30 FPS can be. The animation stutter on the left is so obvious in comparison to me that it actually distracts me and my ability to concentrate on the right-hand side of the footage here. It is really that bad, and this is what is happening in Silent Hill 2 alongside frame time stutters, just like in Jedi Survivor. And technically running the game with a fixed tick is fixing the issue. But based upon all my knowledge, this should not be a reasonable solution. I sent this footage to around 4 people that are experts in the field of rendering and Unreal Engine, and I found a mixed consensus there. I would say the first thing all the experts agreed upon is that the game should not have bad frame time spikes like it has in the first place on any platform, and I agree with that. The second thing they kind of agreed upon is that game engines, in particular on Microsoft Windows, may need better ways to calculate delta time, better than the way it is typically done right now. The third thing that they all kind of agreed upon is that animation stutters should not be happening if the frame times are going to be below the cap like they are here. So something is essentially very wrong in Silent Hill 2. And the fact that I also see this behavior in Jedi Survivor, which I've talked about before, really concerns me. Is this some sort of Windows issue that is coming up in a lot of games? Is this a game-specific issue that is becoming more common for some reason? Is this an Unreal Engine-specific issue? Is this a combination of problems? I have no idea, but it is not my job to fix this issue, and I can really only report on it. This is the situation on PC. On PS5, I cannot say with perfect certainty whether the same thing is occurring there due to VSync, and the fact that we cannot make the game perfectly CPU or GPU limited all the time. But what I do know is that the PlayStation 5 version does showcase animation skipping in moments while traversing the game world. Like here as James is rounding the corner. The frame time graph is technically clean here, yet James's animation jumps a few frames in a way that looks like a frame time hitch. It could be similar to what we're seeing on PC, but I cannot say that for certain. Getting to the end of this video here on Silent Hill 2, I need to say that this game's frame time problems led me down a rabbit hole at the end where I've discovered something unexpected and something even more troubling than bad frame times. Not only can a game have bad frame times, but the way it is handling animation can make it so that even super powerful PCs and frame time caps cannot get smooth animation. I'm not sure what is causing it, but I hope this video makes some waves among developers, maybe IHVs, and maybe even Microsoft. Something ain't right here, and I'm not sure what is at fault. Anyway, like, subscribe, ring the bell, support on Patreon, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.